Hello, does this work? Yeah, okay, cool. So you guys ready? Cool. So most of us in the debate community already know how bad America is, generally speaking, but I think it's high time that on the universal national level, they are recognized for their wrongdoing, and that's why we're very happy to propose. Before I move into my case, I just want to go over some definitions. So, what is an unjust war? I think that generally speaking, this is kind of an ambiguous definition, but I don't think that's what this debate should rest upon. I will go into this in more detail later, but I think that unjust wars include wars that are monetized or created for private rather than national interests that lead to an unnecessary loss of lives and where a lot of war crimes are being committed. These are just a few examples of what we mean by unjust war, but we understand that the intricacies of that can be decided in court. So what is our model? We think that in our model, we will create a separate court in the United States that is appointed by a non-partisan committee, and these will be the judges that will adjudicate on this decision. And I think that it's important to note this model doesn't define the motion, and we're not lawmakers, and that's crucial to note. But moving into a little bit more detail, I think that one, we will consider the context of what information the US government knew at the time, or what the general public knew. Second, we're going to make it a public trial. Three, it can be either class action with a group of individuals or a group of veterans or on an individual basis. And if the soldier wins, they will be A, awarded monetary reparations to the degree it's adjudicated, and B, I think there will be appropriate policy changes made, i.e. the US is forced to resign from the war and pull out, etc., etc. Any clarifications on the model? No. Okay, we're going to forward three arguments in my speech. One, why there's a principal obligation. Two, why we avert unjust wars. And three, how we restore justice to individuals. So first, let's talk about the principal obligation. And I think that in understanding the principal obligation we have to soldiers and why they have the right to sue, it's important to understand why we have wars in the first place and what is the premise of war. In most places, wars are predicated on the fact that they're created because they're necessary, because they're predicated on the fact of national importance and national interest. And that is the narrative that is told to veterans around the world, which is why they should stand up and dedicate their lives for the country, because it's something of national importance. This is the justification that drafts are premised on. This is the justification for why people should go into the military. And I think that when you are drafted into a war that does not satisfy these conditions, that is not based on the premise of this type of national interest, we think it's unjust. And we, more importantly, think it's unjust to individual soldiers. Because in pursuing war, soldiers incur massive individual costs. A, the trivial loss of life that potentially happens when you can't not return. B, literally the loss of the 4 to 8 best years of your entire life. And C, the fact that you may arbitrarily get wartime disabilities when you return to an extenuating extent. All of this combined with the fact that wars are, drafts are largely arbitrary, and even in places where you get a volunteer, it largely selects from the poverty draft, and also the fact that there's negligence of veterans when they come back from war, all combined with the fact that soldiers are just given a very bad deal in most instances. And that deal, if it is not justified on what they were promised, i.e. sacrificing themselves for a national cause, defines the fact that they should have a principal obligation, because the governments lied to these individuals. The premises of war were fraudulent in nature, no thank you, and because of that, you robbed individuals of their life, their liberty, their economic mobility, and everything else. And I think that on that principal level, these individuals deserve that principal obligation. Before that, sure.
Yeah, so is there a distinction between the basis of unjust wars and things like negligence?
So I'll just move into what we think unjust wars are and what their roots are. So A, as I stated earlier, there are wars waged for private interest specifically, right? And I'm talking about wars like the invasion of Afghanistan that were largely waged on the interest to preserve oil and to make sure the US had access to resources rather than for national interest. Two, wars that are waged on political stubbornness, right? When there are often belligerent or confrontational politicians who want to fearmonger and present an enemy, those types of wars are largely unjust. Three, wars that are waged on fallacious pretenses, right? These are wars like the Vietnam War, where the Pentagon Papers that generally hid the large extent of that war and were later uncovered literally meant that the people of the United States were literally being lied to of what it was like down there. Or we're talking about wars like the invasion to Afghanistan that were justified on the premises that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, even though the US government knew that was largely a lie. All of these contribute to what exactly these unjust wars are and what their roots are. Which moves me into my second point. How do we avert these unjust wars? And I think the largest impediment in the status quo to actually stopping unjust wars is the fact that it's very, very difficult to criticize these wars publicly. A, because generally speaking, the public doesn't know anything about the war, and B, because most of the time, governments use things the governments prevent the ability for people to speak out in many scenarios. We think that in many instances, veterans are the only individuals who are actually able to tell people about the stories and narratives of war. And I think uniquely through our platform, we're able to provide soldiers with an outlet to speak out. And I think it's important to know what the comparative is. The comparative is these types of veterans being stuck within the military, where there is a restrictive social hierarchy that silences dissent because you can't speak out because of your rank. It means that individuals don't have the ability to otherwise voice their concerns in that way. And we think that criticism from the military is especially important because it is criticism unlike public protest. It is criticism that's firsthand and colored by the experiences of individuals that allow individuals to shed light on what that life is really like. The second thing to know about how we avert unjust wars is there is now a monetary disincentive towards the prosecution of war. And it's important to note here that wars are often waged over political decisions or over things like natural resources, and we think we disincentivize that when there's a potential for the government to suffer like millions and millions of dollars in paying reparations to soldiers who they unjustly took lives away from. The third thing to note is that there is less lobbying power in courts than in politics. And that's important to understand and what exactly the calculus is when war is decided upon. Because politicians who decide to initiate war on other countries are often colored by money. They're colored by private interest and they're colored by lobbying. And it's important to note that we were able to stop that because these courts, which obviously aren't perfect, are comparatively more apolitical, especially when they're appointed and not colored by lobbying. The fourth thing to note is that politicians and parties might carry the political baggage of being involved in an unjust war, which means, and the outcome of all four of these points, that more thought and more consideration is being put into the prosecution of any particular war and whether or not the grounds on which it was justified. Because it would literally be political suicide if your group or your government was associated with the prosecution of an unjust war. Finally, I want to talk about the restoration of justice. Matt will talk about this more, but very clearly and very quickly, we just think that it's likely to be successful. A, because the moment at which there's a national sentiment that it's an unjust war, it's probably likely that there's already a clear trail of evidence that delineates how it was unjust. There is national sentiment and national scrutiny being put upon the war. And that scrutiny often comes from the opinions and voices of millions of soldiers. So we think it is likely to be successful when these people stand up and rally. But even if it's not successful, we still think it's good because it brings attention to these wars in a way that otherwise would not be able to happen. And it also brings attention to the plight of soldiers who are otherwise ignored in society. We think that for far too long, individuals have been forced into these conditions, and we're proud to stand for their rights for the very first time. Happy to repose. Okay.
It is often when you second guess that you do your very worst. What will we do on our side of the house? First, we're going to make some clarifications. Afterwards, we're going to fall through arguments. How the state doesn't own an obligation to pay and how this is destructive for efficiency of the army. So first, clarifications. First, we want to make three of them. Our first clarification is that we will adopt the status quo, which means that we'll pay soldiers as they're meant to be paid. This means that conscripted soldiers and soldiers voluntarily signed up to go to the war are paid a premium also for entering combat. Second clarification we would like to make is that we would encourage and increase spending for war veterans. This means we will increase programs that help soldiers also reintegrate after coming back from the war. This Our third clarification we'd like to make is that, and this is the most crucial one we'd like to make, is that if war is truly unjust, we think that we wholly support America paying reparations to the countries in which the war was held, meaning that we would repay Iraq and Afghanistan when we waged war there, and that's only one of the examples here. So, crucially, we wholly support the position that America should repay for the damage that they have caused. Moving on to my 2 points about how the state doesn't own an obligation to pay and how it is destructive for the efficiency of the army. So, why doesn't the state own an obligation to pay? Because we think that if we allow the soldiers if we allow the state an obligation to pay, we think that soldiers will be allowed to sue the people. And that is why this is so destructive. We have 2 points. Soldiers consented to be part of the army or paid their fair dues. That is why we say no thank you, it is justified. Second point being that in cases where they are conscripted, we already made an active policy decision to say that you don't have a right to say what the army does or doesn't have. No, doesn't have to do. Note that this is where all our points here stand. Because in this regard, soldiers have already forfeited their right to sue the government. And we think that this is where all our harms come in. Because if the soldiers are unable to conceptualize, because we think soldiers are unable to conceptualize what just or unjust war is. How so? Because we think that they are inherently motivated by personal agendas and they fail to see the bigger picture as a whole. In the instances where they sue the government, we think that this is based on their very own agendas and this is not justified at all. No, thank you. So, when they are entitled to do so, a just or an unjust war can only be measured, we think, on societal good, and that is where the results of the war come in. And when we think that when they tell us, you know what, soldiers can sue, they will conceptualize and they won't see the bigger picture. In the end, we think the suing will be baseless and unjustified, and that we think the government will lose out on this. But where the crux of our case comes in is how it is destructive for the efficiency of the army. How? Because we think that every war we enter, we will say it is just. This deals with their point saying how, you know what, we shouldn't lie to the soldiers. We think we must lie to the soldiers and say it's just because we have to have them the most committed they can possibly be. Off the bat, we say this is necessary even if it is unclear if it's just or not, because soldiers must be fully committed to the cause. We cannot afford them to second guess, no thank you, the mission imperative. We think that when they are allowed to second guess, this loses cohesiveness, and in the end, they also lose efficiency of the army, and we think that is detrimental to the detrimental to the army, and we will lose lots of lives because of this. So moving on, we think that when they allow soldiers the option to sue after the war, we suggest that they have some say as to who is right and who is wrong. But we think that in the first place, when you second guess on the battlefield, we think this is where it is most detrimental. So, what are our harms? We think it decreases mission efficiency because soldiers need to second guess what they do during the battle and after the battle and before the battle. And 2, we think it affects the morale of the entire battalion and jeopardizes, no thank you, the safety of all because they second guess, because they doubt, and because they are not fully committed to the war. 3rd, we think it jeopardizes the safety of individual soldiers also, as we have proven. When you lose the cohesiveness, I'll take you in a bit. When we lose the cohesiveness, this is where people fall. This is where people die. And when we allow them to second guess, this is where all our harms are present. Yes.
So if you think governments literally have to lie to people about the pretenses of that war, then that war is being prosecuted without the mandate of every single person in the public. So who in your government then decides whether or not it's good to commit war?
We think that when a government understands that this war is beneficial to the country and beneficial because of resources and also because of the government's, it's in line with the government's values, this is where we say this is a war we should take. And that is why we think that your POI is pretty irrelevant, because when we think that a government is able to look at the bigger picture and look at when and why they should wage war. And when the soldiers on your side are allowed to second guess this, we think that this is detrimental for all the harms we have told you. So, suing creates all these harms we have told you. And when they say, when they say that this could be successful, we on our side believe that this is the most catastrophic failure and the worst thing you can possibly do to the morale and to the spirit of the army as a whole. So, final rebuttals to their points about how, people have personal agendas or whatever. Look, we think that if people have personal agendas and wage war, and we will prosecute them in the first place. We'll prosecute them, who is responsible, the people irresponsible involved, and finally, we will sue them if possible. But we think that the soldiers shouldn't have the ability to do this because they are unable to look at the bigger picture. Finally, they told us that, they told us about PTSD and all that. But we think that we are also highly supportive of people that come back from war that have PTSD. We think that these are our obligations. That's why we have so many rehabilitation services, and that's why we put so many resources in order to allow them to rehab properly. This is different from allowing them to sue because we think that they do not have an obligation in the theater of war and they fail to see the bigger picture at this point. So, I urge you to vote for us on the basis that when you second guess, you do your very worst.
Let's be very, very, very clear. Soldiers' rights are being violated. They are coming back with PTSD for absolutely no reason. They are losing their lives, they are losing their dignity, and they are losing the very essence of why they joined and became a soldier. We are lying to these soldiers, and the only solution that OO presents is the government will sue itself and prosecute its own military generals and therefore hold these people accountable. I just think it's a very strange solution. They need to substantiate that much better. In absence of any other accountability mechanism appearing in their case, we need to realize that the military is completely unaccountable in today's status quo. The fact that politicians are almost always willing to support the military, almost always going to support them, because it's hard to get the military lobby off of your back otherwise. We think that there is no accountability mechanism. That's horrible on their side of the debate. I'm going to talk about roughly 4 things in this speech. Number 1, soldiers' rights. Number 2, accountability. Number 3, hierarchy. And number 4, divulging military secrets, as closing out might choose to run. So, firstly, on soldiers' rights. The first thing that they said was, we're going to throw some money at soldiers, right? Because this will solve all the problems. Now, clearly, we give this to soldiers money in the status quo because they are serving our military. The claim that we made was different. We told you that these soldiers have been lied to and they have been given undue harm for their nation. So, what they need is, A, a recognition that they have been disproportionately harmed by unjust war as opposed to other soldiers who fought in more just wars or were not abused by the military, and B, recognition that the government needs to apologize rather than just give them money like they would any other soldier. Something that doesn't happen on their side of the house. We think that's necessary for soldiers because when you sign into the military, you don't sign into being abused by your government and treating like an instrumental object. Now, next, what they said is oh, you consented to being abused by the military. You consented into not suing. So, number 1, I think that you didn't consent because we told you that this is an instance of fraud. Why? Because soldiers joined because they were thinking that they would help the common person next to them because they thought this had a grander national purpose. But in fact, as we told you, unjust wars are fought for private reasons, fought for political reasons, rather than fought for helping the nation itself. We think that that's incredibly problematic on their side of the house. That's something that they didn't respond to. Fraud means that they didn't consent to this. Secondly, it means that, I would point out that this is disproportionately targeted towards poor individuals, and that's why I say it wouldn't be a completely free choice as well. Because if you're poor and the military recruiter shows up at your school and says, hey, we're going to send you to college, we're going to give you some money, you just have to sign some forms and then go to the military, you don't know exactly what you're getting yourself into, and often there are asymmetric information in these circumstances. And thirdly, because some of these soldiers were and will be drafted, and that we think that's incredibly problematic as well. So we don't think it's good enough for them to say that you can sign away your rights for some dubious harm that no one actually thinks is going to happen in the future. We are willing to defend soldiers' rights if it means infringing slightly on the US's concept of dignity and lawsuits that they sign. Crucially then, soldiers' rights are important in this debate. We would say that that's more important than any like American greater hegemony harm, that because soldiers individually on the ground are being harmed. I don't know what the purpose of a government is if you are abusing your citizens in the way that they are. Secondly, on accountability, we won't stop every unjust war, but we will stop some. We will adjust the way that some are prosecuted, and we will change the way that the military and politicians act in the future to make them far more accountable. 2 questions under this. Number 1, why soldiers? We say firstly because soldiers are best positioned to know whether these conflicts are just or not. These were the people that were actually on the battlefield. These are the people actually given information. These are the people in the context knowing what was happening on the ground rather than politicians who were removed or citizens who weren't necessarily right there. Number 2, because we need to break military nationalism, something that doesn't happen on their side of the house. What happens is that the military has a very strong old boys club right now, where older military men feel like the good old days must be preserved. And therefore there's a military bloc not only in terms of lobbying, but also in terms of the population. What that crucially means is that most Americans and this lobbying bloc indeed feel like you always need to support the military. Not at this time, please sit down. And what that means is that it's very hard for any civilian, say, to critique the military. But once you start seeing other soldiers trying to critique the military, and once you start seeing soldiers that are younger than you might extend your sympathies to them as an older soldier, for example, and say that this critique is valid because they actually know what was happening, rather than civilians who were disaffected from this war. That also means that more soldiers are willing to come out in a sort of soldier Me Too movement, because otherwise they may feel like they were disobeying the hierarchy of the military that they were within. So there's no way to get soldier accountability on their side of the house. Finally, why courts? We think the courts are incredibly important. No. Firstly, because you can introduce evidence. This is particularly important. Why? Because it is political suicide for you or your party to be involved with meddling in these elections, and this is a place where we can uniquely call out evidence to be presented to the court because it is a legal obligation, rather than newspapers doing independent investigations, which are not investigated as much. Please sit down. Wait, okay, sorry. Secondly, because you have to force issues to be public, right? Now these are issues that come to the forefront and come to society and are investigated, rather than issues that are done in backroom deals. Thirdly, because this is a venue for criticism. This is essential, because the way that politicians operate right now, as we learned from the Trump motion, is they dismiss things very, very quickly. And the way that they handle the media is simply by delaying until no one cares anymore. Holding them accountable in a court system where they actually need to respond to the criticisms levied upon them, or else the court will not listen to them, is incredibly important. Finally, less lobbying. This is incredibly important because it's hard to track whether senators are being lobbied, but if there is a court of nonpartisan individuals appointed by a committee of nonpartisan individuals, then it's much easier to track the lobbying that influences them, whereas politicians are much easier to lobby from like various gun rights associations or soldiers associations, etc. That's much more influential on your side of the house. If closing wants to offer me a POI, I'm happy to take them. The next thing I want to talk about is hierarchy. What they said is essentially soldiers shouldn't second guess. Fine, opening.
In your very public trials, are there restrictions on things like discovery processes and cross-examination of witnesses?
Yeah, okay, so I'll talk about that in a moment. So firstly on hierarchy, so they said soldiers shouldn't second guess. I think soldiers should second guess, not only for the principled reasons we talked about earlier, because soldiers have rights too, and transgender soldiers and women soldiers who are being abused in the military have rights too and should be able to speak out, but also because they're probably not second guessing like in battle, right? Soldiers are often disciplined, they know how to do their job, they're not thinking about these things while they're on the war field because probably they don't want to die, right? So like that's something that doesn't make sense to me on their side of the house. But crucially, they don't understand how morale works, because morale is rallied up by officers that you respect, officers that you feel you can have a reciprocal good relationship with. We see this in every other segment of society. Why is it that the military specifically requires you to bow down to your overlord hierarchy military officer? We say that's because of an old boys club, not because it's actually particularly effective. Finally, on divulging military secrets, number one, like soldiers know stuff, so generally they're going to know whether this is the best lawsuit to bring or not. Secondly, like during or after the war, the purpose of a lawsuit is lessened, or the harm to secrecy is lessened, because the influence of secrecy is much smaller. Something has probably already happened. You've already taken your first actions. Secondly, secrecy is most important for small-scale operations or secret strikes, i.e. Bin Laden. Thirdly, America's problem is not that it's not efficient enough, but that its military is too efficient. So even if we make the military slightly less efficient, or we have to make small caveats, we're willing to take that, because American military needs to be checked more than it needs to be helped right now. Very proud to propose.
Yeah.
in my speech, I'm going to explain why the American judicial system or trial system is one that is fundamentally incompatible to a system or the goals that the OG wants to achieve or the Gov bench wants to achieve, especially when the Gov bench and now the closing house unfortunately has to defend public trial systems as a whole. I'm going to also explain to you why, even if we have Chelsea Manning situations, why even in those circumstances it's still beneficial to in any case not allow suits to be taken against the state. The starting rebuttal that I have is really just simply this. None of the benefits that the opening government talks about needs to be achieved or can only be achieved by virtue of suing the American government. They said a few things, like literally everything, from solving transgender inequality in the army, to helping poor vets, reducing the influence of politics, increasing accountability, everything in the kitchen sink, essentially. So here's a few responses. First, does it really change anything? The decision-making calculus which states take to enter war doesn't change at the end of the day just because you have a class action lawsuit that goes against them. It might perhaps be an irksome thing, but at the end of the day, the politicians who decide are not the ones at trial, and even if they were, we suggest that the largesse of the state will easily pay out the class action lawsuits, even if they wanted to say something like that. Second of all, sometimes political motivations are good. In fact, the prevailing trend in the US that no politician would touch any military intervention with a 3-mile stick unless you are Donald Trump, and even in his case, he hasn't really done anything in any case. So if you're interested in stopping wars, perhaps some of these political motivations are things you want to think about. Third and last of all, if it's really private individuals who are responsible for these colossal mess-ups, then it's far better to sue and prosecute these private individuals that will stop these private individuals from doing things in the first place. How exactly, giving some kind of reparation to a soldier affects all of these particular political things is beyond me. But let's just say that these individual soldiers did hurt, and quizzically, none of the opening government speakers actually told us what exactly they're suffering from and why a soldier in an unjust war suffers more than a soldier in a just war. Maybe his feelings got a bit more hurt or betrayed as a consequence of it, but perhaps, in any case, our opening opposition model wants to cater to every single one of them in a way that doesn't require you to sue these individual actors. The suggestion here is, if you take up the Gov's policy, if these individual vets don't take the option to sue, then what are we going to do? Because it is your right to sue if you don't pursue it, does it mean the state doesn't have to do anything about you? The suggestion in the past is precisely that they don't. When you have an option to exercise your right and take the action against the state, they traditionally use that as an excuse to opt out on things like welfare to these vets, which you suggest is considerably worse. So first, why is this considerably bad? Yeah, sure.
So given that you're defending the status quo, note that veterans in America literally get the worst treatment out of every veteran country in the world. So what exactly are you defending in terms of good treatment that these people would otherwise abdicate themselves of?
I suggest that there are problems with the status quo that needs to be improved slightly, and that's basically our position. Moving forward, there are two particular things that we accept to be true within the status quo. While we accept that people should have some degree of autonomy and agency over things that the government does, there are some things we keep out for these individuals, such as the ability to decide foreign policy, financial policy, and most importantly and relevantly, war policy. Two things here are the reasons why. First, people are unable fundamentally to conceptualize the utilitarian calculus, no thank you, because rightly so, they are primarily motivated and prioritize individual motivations as a whole. That's one. But second of all, we think because of the ability to be privy to information and make decisions, they fundamentally cannot be able to make these decisions in the first place. What are these particular individual information that we talk about? No, that we're talking about individual people, for example, double agents who are working for the state, individual actors who act on the particular states, individual civilians who perhaps come forward at the expense of being persecuted by dictators to come forward to give these testimonies to individual armed forces and the like. The reason why we don't allow them to make these decisions, because one, most of the individual citizens are motivated precisely by their private motivations, which means to say, more often than not, when we need to fight just wars, they opt not to because they are fearful of war to start it. Second of all, they don't conceptualize or understand strategic importance past what they've been educated with or able to see as a consequence. The long and short of it, no thank you, is if the government bench doesn't want to review confidential information, the next problem is going to come about. The American court system doesn't work. In fact, I suggest any trial system would work because fundamentally you won't get a result. If you want to do things like discovery, uncover documents, if you want to subpoena witnesses to stand in front of a stand on television and give testimony and be crucified by lawyers, then you have to have a system that really makes sense. And this system, I suggest, in the best case of the opening government, is going to put witnesses at jeopardy, is going to put military personnel who back their information and safety on individuals who come forward willingly at risk of being persecuted also at jeopardy. You're putting millions of lives of individuals at jeopardy as well. I suggest, no thank you, Knowing information of strategic locations and bases are also vital parts of the decision-making process that the politicians will take into consideration that will also need to be unveiled in your particular policy en route to the particular truth. Given that that's the case, this puts millions of Americans in secret bases across the world in huge amounts of jeopardy. It's just so you can allow these individuals to claim some kind of reparation for the state when you can already provide the same kind of monetary repentance to them. If that's all not enough, we think that it's immoral to allow individuals who came forward on the basis of morality to be questioned in the first place. If you question or wanted these witnesses to come forward and to provide your army with this sort of secret information, you wouldn't crucify them in a public trial. We think that all of these information allows better and just wars to be persecuted as a whole. Next, the jury system of the American trial courts makes it impossible for fair verdicts to be decided. One of the classical problems with the American system that can be ameliorated just because they don't prefer the judge system unless they hit the Supreme Court is the jury system. Insofar as they want to publicize trials of wars that are already unpopular, no thank you, we suggest that no jury in the world or in America is able to reach a fair verdict, a fair decision, no less because no one opening government decided to tell us how in the world we're going to allow these juries to make a fair verdict in any case. We say it's especially because of the fatigue that they face in part of these wars that it becomes impossible for these juries to make objective decisions even if they're presented with truths which no one opening government said they were going to present in any case. Contrary to all of this, why even if there was a Bradley Chelsea Manning situation in the future, why we shouldn't in any case allow him to sue retrospectively. We think far more important to all these things, there are other ways which we can do or amend these particular mess-ups. For instance, prosecuting the individuals who are responsible for these negligent actions to start with, which I suggested already. But in any case, these questions of morality are difficult situations. It's not always going to be Afghanistan and Iraq. It's going to be things, for example, whether or not we should have done something in Syria when people cross particular lines in the sand that they shouldn't. It is these lines of morality that are hard to make adjudications on, that in any case that we should respect decisions made from one government to another so that when it comes to taking difficult moral decisions, they can do so without fear of reprisal in any circumstance. That is the key to be able to fight and prosecute important just wars in any circumstance, and say that you can retrospectively determine individual states' worth of decisions means that you can't ever be able to be sure one side or another of this or these particular questions of morality that are already difficult to adjudicate upon. For these reasons, we oppose.
Can everyone hear me? I'm going to go through three extensions in my speech. Firstly, on a bit of clarification of the waffling in opening house. Secondly, on why we get better discourse and justification for war. Thirdly, on the importance of international norms. But before that, a bit of clarification and rebuttal to opening opposition, right? 7 main points. So firstly, they talk about the idea that, individual soldiers have really consented, right? And the fact that you are bound by active policy decisions, that's a thing. Look, we think that soldiers only consent to just wars, not these other harms that come from unjust wars, right? In any case, we think consent is limited to begin with because you don't really understand the full extent of harm that goes in war. But more importantly, we deal with the idea of conscription and why so that's harmful in 8 layers, right? Firstly, there's no actual contract to enter into that particular kind of obligation. Secondly, the nature of that understanding and the contract is coercive even if existent. Thirdly, the fact that you were born into a birth lottery means that there are no alternative pathways in terms of what other countries you can go to. Fourthly, the fact that your identity might be different from national conception is a thing. Fifthly, this particular form of conscripting that soldier is further coercive. Six, the fact that utilitarian balance, you harm them so much more, as opposed to the other side. Seven, the fact you force themselves to unself-actualize, and the fact that there's no reciprocity for this coercive conduct and harm is why that doesn't really stand, right? But then it tells the soldiers can't really tell if it's unjust. We think that in the course of litigation, you're likely to ask for legal advice, and they'll usually tell you if it's a plausible claim or not, whether or not it's really an unjust war, right? But we think there's also other things that are clearly observable as to whether or not it's unjust. No. Then they say that the third thing, that soldiers second guess and also affect the morale, right? Because we don't think this is likely to occur because they themselves said that the soldiers literally don't know what is happening on the ground, right? But more importantly, we also say that you can just out of the reason that you don't want to second guess and lose your lives, that's not going to happen. But then they say the fourth point, that politicians are not the ones trial, therefore this doesn't really impact the entire conduct of war. We think that at the very least, you limit the harm that's done in war in terms of the individual soldiers or the commanders who are making these decisions, right? They have more of an incentive to restrain their conduct so that they don't get sued and are held accountable. And the fifth thing they said was this idea that you risk military witnesses, right? We think that SASCO has many mechanisms to deal with this, right? The fact that you have anonymous witnesses, the fact that you have legal teams who swear confidentiality, in dealing with these cases, and even if that's the case, right? We think that even if the courtroom is not public, you can still make the judgment public. We see this already happening in the prosecution or cases regarding state spies or police double agents. We don't think that's really an issue. But then they say jury system, that the jury system cannot really disarm this idea. We say that in many of these cases, whether or not it's an unjust war is really a determination of the issue of law, not facts, so we don't think that's relevant at all. Seventh point, they said, was that the alternative is prosecuting these soldiers, right, by criminal litigation. We don't think that's really inconsistent with their team line because we think that's purely a perverse incentive on behalf of those soldiers, on behalf of the prosecutor, to not jeopardize national interests. That being said, moving on to the first bit of clarification. We think that the important principle framing that was lacking in the opening debate was what exactly is an unjust war, right? We think that there are many more actual criteria apart from the extremely restrictive criteria the OG gave you, right? We think things like just cause, comparative justice, competent authority, the right intention, probability of success, last resort proportionality, right? And the more important thing is, we think on the matter of principle, wars should be used as a matter of last resort. They should not be used wherever they want to be, right? And this is the crucial thing that we think are missing from opening government. Second thing, right? Why we think we need to better justification on our side of the house? No. What we think is likely to happen is that now that you force the justification for war to go on inside courts of justice as opposed to parliament, right? Why we think this is a comparatively better way? Why we think there are better incentives, right? Firstly, the fact that you have electoral, you remove the idea of electoral incentives on their side. The fact that you're forced to go for the legal framework to explain these things is a very much bigger reason why the sort of justification will be much more adhered to a legal framework, or to be explained not to incent and inflammatory ways to get voters to vote for you, but in a way that actually holds up watertight in the court of law. That's the first reason, right? Second reason, the fact that it's more structured and you have to select certain issues which are to be permissible in discussing this means that you don't get any sort of stupid rhetoric that come from politicians, right? Thirdly, the fact that judges are unbiased relative to politicians who are much more biased, which is another reason why we think that the discourse, justification for whether or not laws are just or not is better on our side than on their side. Sure. I'm closing.
If the Supreme Court is able to justify the Muslim ban on national security grounds, how is the same legal system going to produce the same kind of evidence that will actually prove that this war is unjust?
We think just because one instance has happened, that does not mean all future instances will be the same. But more importantly, we think that even if the Supreme Court is unlikely to be in these severe matters of national interest, courts are likely to take greater scrutiny and not just make something that's blatantly fitting in with political interest. We don't think that point stands at all. But thirdly, right, and why we think it removes respect for international norms and how we solve that on our side. We know too the fact that the urgency of this entire motion, right? Three main characterizations we bring to you from Sichi. The fact that we have a warmongering president in power is a reason why there should be more constraints in the ability of the US to conduct war. Secondly, the fact that the US is currently not under ICC jurisdiction is another reason why we think there should be more ways in which we restrict their ability to do things. But thirdly, the fact that the US currently does not feel restrained by UN conventions in its ways of engaging in conflicts and going into war. We point to the fact of Iraq, right? What do we think is likely to happen in SASCO is that they're likely to use military right to pursue perverse incentives, right? Why do we change this on our side, and why do we think this is comparatively better, right? We think that the very reason why we see aggressive states in the status quo engaging in certain kinds of conflicts or certain kinds of military interventions is because of the fact that they can point to the fact that US is not following as well. At that point, we think that the US loses a lot of the moral high ground with which it can use to criticize the legitimacy of these actions, right? It also emboldens and encourages aggressive states, and we think that this usually leads to like extreme kinds of harms, right? The fact that you usually when the US does something wrong, it leads to certain kinds of slippery slope. For example, the fact that when the US withdrew with the Kyoto Protocol, then Canada and also other states withdrew from it altogether, right? We think that US is oftentimes an extremely important and crucial part in terms of like how international norms are shaped. The point at which the US is not held accountable, that is extremely harmful. And that's why we think we solve this, right? We think that soldiers have much of an incentive to sue them because of the fact that A, they're now tried in courts of law, as opposed to military tribunals, right? There's a greater chance of fair trial. Second fact is that they're extremely likely to want compensation from the state, right? The fact that veterans usually bring complaints against the state after having gone through war. Thirdly, the fact that they're likely to receive funds from NGOs who want to see these cases go through means that the very idea of financial incapacity is unlikely to be a feasibility challenge on their side of the house. But even if closing tries to talk about, right, why we think intervention by the US is so important, we think the comparative on UN is better, right? Why? Three main reasons. Firstly, because of greater accountability conducted when it's done by UN peacekeepers. Secondly, the fact that US rarely does post-conflict reconciliation and rarely does it well. Thirdly, the fact that it's unlikely to stay in countries for a long time because of electoral incentives, because of local opposition, and because of the pull of the BRICS. Because of all the reasons that we told you, because of the fact that this justification is better on our side, and the fact that you mean greater respect for international norms of OCG.
So government comes up and tell us that because the United States of America in its entirety of existence has been a warmongering state and has thus been involved in many unjust wars, well, soldiers still somehow join. I mean, in the military we say that US Marines are so stupid that they eat crayons for breakfast. I think that's true if that is the case, because even after so much discussion about how each US conflict is so immoral and that there's so many gray areas, they still manage to join. Number one, they're either stupid, or number two, the fact that they need to bear the consequences of making morally culpable or questionable decisions also lies on them, in that they know that they sometimes may have to face these decisions that will challenge their morality and rock them to their core. I think that every single US soldier that I met during the duration of my service in the Korean military is fully aware of these consequences, and I don't think that their point on consent even stands, because even if I were to view it on a very logical, level-headed, civilian level, soldiers get to mostly choose their MOS, which stands for Military Occupational Specialty, in which you know which kind of department you are going into. Obviously, if you're going into signal or radar, you are not going to do as much questionable decisions as, say, reconnaissance, ranger, or special assault, right? So we think that since the bulk of these decisions are not borne by the people who manage the radars, but rather the people who jump out of airplanes and go into villages to sweep them and then possibly interrogate civilians, that the consent already falls into our ballpark of the debate, right? But I think that I need to ask you two questions. The first is justice, because the opening debate did a terrible job on looking at the quotations. What is justice, and how do we best deliver this kind of justice? Because we all agree that it is a necessary component. And the second question that I'm going to ask you today is about the combatant. All right, let's go to justice. Justice. The first question that I need to ask about justice is, how do you determine what is just and what is unjust? Who is the party that bears the responsibility to decide justice? So far, we have two responses from the government side, right? The first is, of course, the soldiers. Now, soldiers are automatically clouded by the fog of war. Their memories, their decisions are all clouded by the fact that they could die any moment and that a bullet in the face could actually kill them. But I think that more important than the fog of war is that they're unable to see the larger level of decisions. Because you could say that when the 82nd Airborne Division was dropped into the fields of France, that largely speaking, World War II was a justifiable war. But they may be able to question the moral standing of the combat itself that they were involved in. And so if they see that their combat was immoral, it is not sufficient to prove why the war itself was unjust. Notice that we're not talking about injustices in military disposition or allocation of resources, but as a war itself, is it unjust? And that is a whopping claim that you need a lot of evidence to prove, all right? But I think that more important than the soldiers themselves are the judges, because obviously if they're going to have this so-called public trial, they will need someone to oversee and make the decision at the end of the day. Please sit down. I don't think that the judges are any more capable of seeing this decision, because I don't think that a consensus on war and whether it is just or not does not come from a bunch of guys, or maybe women, who studied the books on what is justice, right? Because justice comes from a historical consensus, not on the decision of people who say, I think this is pretty okay. When we look at all the discussion that is going on and the disagreements in the Supreme Courts around the world, particularly even the United States of America, if you think that the same courts are capable of making a decision that will create a historical precedent, I find that to be quite scary. But let's look at the other side of the table, right? What if they say that it was in fact just? Now I have two facets to this. The first, I will prove why they will most likely say that the war itself was just. Because if you look at the judge composition of the United States of America, whether they're conservative or liberal, it doesn't really matter. But the United States of America as a country has an incentive to keep involving itself into wars. And the justice system tends to be very complicit of this fact, that they understand that there is a national security need, and they tend to make it as an excuse to override personal grievances. Look at how the United States Supreme Court or other courts deal with the concept of superior orders, in which a soldier declares that there was an order that was unjustly done onto him, and he was forced to carry it out. Most of the time, they just neglect it. But I think that the even more pressing social consequences, if they say that it was just, the very official stamp of approval that they say can exonerate the soldier of his or her personal grievances will be able to damn them into an official consensus that that person is culpable for their own actions and therefore is perfectly fine in bearing that emotional burden. And that, as a former soldier, is extremely scary. Now, the next point I want to talk about, the second one, is that it will damage true justice. Because when we talk about the concept of justice in war, we need to ask about two different concepts. Number one, jus ad bellum, and number two, jus in bello, which is basically the justice of war and the justice in war. These are perfectly different. But when we talk about the particular opinions that these soldiers have to offer, it normally focuses on the latter, justice in war and its combat. We think that it will deter focus from the actual victims of the war, because what you are basically saying is, look, I was forced to kill a bunch of little kids in Vietnam. I was forced to deploy Agent Orange, a poisonous gas. But I am the person who must be exonerated by the court of my country because I was forced to make an egregious moral decision that made me morally question myself. So the biggest harm that the soldier gets may be PTSD, and sure, that is terrible. But we think that this focuses the discussion, because America is incentivized to protect its soldiers on at least an emotional level, right? From the people who are actually harmed by the actions of these soldiers. And again, yes, we do bite the bullet, not a pun really, that the soldier needs to bear that emotional burden because they know what they're getting into. The third point I want to talk about is, so how do we gain justice? And this is where we really need to listen, because I think everyone in this room has an opinion on what justice is. Understand that no single person can tell you what is inherently just or unjust until a large body, a critical mass of people believe that it is just. In other words, justice is inevitably and almost exclusively a consequence of social consensus on what is just or not. In other words, a jury, a trial can never make out what is truly just by societal terms. Every war must be evaluated with a long period of time without immediate gratification of delivering justice. Society itself must come to a consensus, and yes, it is slow, yes, it is painful, but you have far more sources of information, far many opinions, and in this case, you can even consult the soldiers if proposition really desires to do that, all right? But the second point I want to talk about is the individual combatant, in that if the military is incentivized to keep themselves more efficient, that you will have to indoctrinate the soldier even further, in two ways. Number one, by demonization of the enemy, and number two, by strengthening of solidarity, by saying that if you rat on one another, you are not a true soldier, and you are not doing your purpose. And trust me, although it sounds very wishy-washy, it works. I still call North Koreans fucking commies, okay? Because that's what they asked me to call them. And this kind of identification of the enemy is crucial into the functioning of the military. If they are afraid that they're going to be sued and bear the legal consequences, I think that this indoctrination will happen even further. But the deferral of morality is even more critical, because you can always blame the government after committing an egregious anti-ethical deed, say that I was forced to do so. In other words, the deferral of superior orders is quite a scary consequence. And because we believe that and we acknowledge that the trail and the journey of the soldier is a hard one, it is full of hardship and moral decision and physical pain, but they still have to bear it if they choose to serve the nation. And that is no different, even if it is the United States of America. Thank you.
Testing. Can I start? We think we are the house which wins this debate because we have filled in 3 unique things that are necessary for any side to claim benefits under this motion. A, we've told you why these soldiers actually will sue in order to incur the benefits that opening talked about. B, we uniquely told you why these courts can actually make decisions in response to OO's mass characterization of practical harms. And C, we uniquely told you why judicial discourse is the preferable form of recognition that a war is unjust, and we also uniquely told you what just war actually is. That's why we think we win. I'll be going over 3 things mainly. Firstly, on the principle. Secondly, in terms of justice, which is the main bulk of closing opposition's material. And thirdly, flagging why our arguments are the most important. Before that, extraneous rebuttal on this simple idea by them that there will be further indoctrination. They've never given the necessary incentive analysis to show why, by virtue of this motion, there would be further indoctrination that's worse off than that in the status quo, which they already concede is pretty bad, as Andy visibly demonstrated, right? The point is, we say that given that we agreed generally with OO's characterization, that probably soldiers on the ground at the point in combat wouldn't know enough high-level material in order to, at that point in time, bring a lawsuit. We think many times these things are ex post facto, which means that really in the point of military indoctrination, there's no incentive to further push soldiers in terms of this, right? We don't see how this is uniquely attributable to this, nor do we see any incentive analysis that's necessary for them to claim credit on that argument, right? So firstly, on the principle, why do we think ultimately that this is principally justified? The problem with most of opposition's reputation is simply consent. The problem is there's a difference between consenting all the harms of war used as a last resort, as is clearly required under the just war criteria as Ivan uniquely brought you, and the indiscriminate exposure of myself to all these harms at any juncture simply for some negligible state gain. We think that is the exact disparity whereby individuals consent to the former but not the latter. And that's exactly what feeds into Ivan's contribution when he clearly gave you the list of criterion for the just war theory, right? The fact that wars have to have good reason, the fact that they have to be proportionate, the fact that they have to be a last resort means that these are all embedded pretexts into soldiers actually going out and risking their lives, right? So when the state ultimately acts against this by indiscriminately utilizing individuals in ways outside of the just war criteria, we say that there is a principal obligation of reparation, right? Which takes me then to the idea by closing opposition that, look, justice is a big deal and we don't think this is possible to be analyzed and things like that. One, we've already uniquely told you why there are established legal criteria in international law for telling what a just war actually is, and we are happy if you want to, given that this is a court motion, to stand by those criteria as what we think a just war actually is, right? We think there's no difficulty in terms of determination as the courts like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court have consistently done these determinations without error in the past, right? The fact, for example, where the US invasion in Nicaragua was deemed illegal by the International Court of Justice back in the 1800s as an unjust war was a clear example that these criteria are accessible and analyzable by legal experts in court. We don't think their analysis on public opinion and how soldiers' perceptions of these things change is actually very important in this debate, because we have clearly based our model on the fact that courts are the individuals who decide and adjudicate on this, so therefore, to a large extent, public opinion is insulated anyway on either side of the house, right? But why is court adjudication so important in this debate, which uniquely brings me to Ivan's material, right?
First, we were the only house who's shown you why, particularly for the US, there is an urgency in the status quo to ensure more checks and balances against unilateral intervention, right? The fact that Trump operates under belligerent rhetorics that often threaten war or invasion or aggressive acts, the fact that the US is not under other international mechanisms such as the ICC or the ICJ, the fact that the US as well often in past contact has largely ignored the normative constraints that would otherwise exist on war. For example, the fact that the US did not seek UNSC authorization before invading Iraq and things like that, which means uniquely we need to put this mechanism in place to ensure that the US actually is controlled. But why is this mechanism uniquely important, right? Ivan's analysis on the judicial discourse that this mechanism gives out means that ultimately decisions have to be more reasoned and have to be much better explained than legislative politicized discourse of how the war actually is. Why is this important? Because historically, the US has been almost reluctant to actually endorse the fact that a war was unjust. The fact that they've tried again and again to make different justifications in order to wiggle their way around, for example, the invasion of Iraq and other things, shows, for example, how hard it is to get the US to actually acknowledge this as a normative check and balance. Before, I'll take you in a second. You think this changes when the US courts themselves are this mouthpiece under this motion, right? The fact that your own judicial system is the mouthpiece speaking out means that ultimately it's far harder to criticize or delegitimize the very backbone of your own separation of powers and of your own courts when your own courts themselves roll under this motion that your war is unjust. It means that comparatively you have a net gain of making it far more likely that the US has to admit that its wars are unjust, and therefore the normative consequences of that internationally bear far more burden on our side of the house because this is far more likely to happen. Yes.
An accepted tenet of democracy is that the judiciary does not interfere with the determining policy of the state. Why is it okay to allow a jury of emotionally suggestible people selected at random determine policies on morality?
We've already said that the jury does not apply because this is a legal determination by a judge, right? And even more importantly, we say quite uniquely the legal framework is important here. The fact that there are principled decisions and precedents largely reduces the wiggle room America has in order to justify its decisions to go to war when we compare that to the status quo on that side of the house. The fact that you have to abide by these principles, the fact that there are reasoned individuals arguing them in court means that far likely there would be a legitimate determination of whether the war was just. Which means likely to their contention that, look, the GOP put these individuals in the Senate and that's a bad thing. One, we think that ultimately, quite often in many of these cases, the legal criteria is still largely binary. There's only so much gray area that you can go and argue that a war was unjust. For example, wars that are blatantly unjust, like going to war under false pretexts like WMD, simply can't be argued around in status quo. But even more importantly, these individuals also have reputation in the public discourse post-judgment to cater about, right? The fact that if they come with a very unreasoned decisions means that legal academics in international criminal law and other facets and also the general public would go and criticize them, means that they would far more likely handle this with care and caution needed to come to a principled conclusion and decision, right? Which also means we gain the net benefit on our side of ensuring that America is able to now concede to the fact that some of its wars are unjust, which means the international checks and balances in terms of, say, other states criticizing this, the Chilcot report or other things are far more likely felt because we're able to get a net gain in terms of America recognizing this on our side of the house. Because we uniquely told you the comparative in terms of this net gain, the urgency, as well as why soldiers would actually sue. We can't be prouder to propose.
Thank you, Gavin Wood, for their remarks. I now invite the opposition whip to go through the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, so the entire Gulf bench basically came up with this idea that America, which has been historically so pro-war and whose presidency and the whole government has so much resources to actually mobilize for war and to indoctrinate the whole population and as well as their politicians that their wars are just, that somehow establishing a panel of independent jurors who are presumably Americans will just stop wars on their track, right? We think that it is very implausible, and we think that the biggest impact in today's debate is how this will actually change U.S. military behavior on the ground when they actually conduct those wars, right? And therefore, our House win out by bringing our unique extension in terms of how this will change the military and the soldiers which are not engaged on the other side, right? So first, just one standalone rebuttals, and the other rebuttals will be integrated. So they talk about how legal standards are just objective, and you can just import like ICC standards on those things. We think that first of all, those international standards are already being debated and also like extremely narrow in their scope, right? So it's only talking about like genocide or crimes against humanity. You cannot necessarily borrow that into like more nuanced situations such as U.S. invasion of Iraq, right? We say that the very involvement of the United States government in shaping those international doctrines and crafting those international charters means that there is no way for the U.S. to be actually implicated for conducting unjust war, right? And secondly, they rely on this wishy-washy model that on opening government they have this idea of public trial and somehow in their lower house they just shifted to a secret trial. We think that we think that when you talk about actually national security information, when you actually have an American courtroom, even if you have like legal doctrine, if you change the legal doctrines about whole like executive privilege and national security, and you have a whole body of law, we think that the United States government has so much legal resources to actually fight that, right? So stuff like whether the U.S. government actually know about weapons of mass destruction, which the U.S. government has tried so hard to keep from public, will continue to be kept from public view. So instead, we'll have a very difficult case for plaintiffs to actually prove that the United States government will actually conducting unjust war. I'll take opening.
So your extension nitpicks that U.S. courts are belligerent in crapping institutions, ignoring our model. So to be clear, is your counterfactual OOs, which also uses courts, or something that didn't appear in your extension speech?
We think that it is just like we rely on the model that we provide more funding for military and veterans care, but we think that our primary mechanism is through like gradual long-term public opinion change, right? So that you actually have a consensus about, for example, Vietnam is bad or Iraq is bad, so that when Congress elect new representatives, you'll have like more pacifist politicians that will actually oppose those wars, right?
Before you move on.
So moving on to the clashes of today's debate. So first of all, like all houses focus a lot on the principal nuance of how there is established consent. And like our opening house basically are deadlocked in terms of arguing whether like soldiers have consented or not. We think that my previous member has uniquely brought you to like what soldiers' role in the military actually are. Therefore, a more nuanced conception of how much soldiers have consented to this war, right? So for people who actually have been in the battlefield and who have consented to this
information
and morally dubious situations, we think that precisely those people are not entitled to this kind of action, right? And we also bring you a more nuanced conception of justice that is based that is not only based on like conducting war but also causes of war, which is not like anywhere engaged on the government back, except when they say that while soldiers somehow consent to a theoretical understanding of what just war is. We think that if you ask actually ordinary American soldiers, they have not read what just war is, right? So the whole point about like them actually consenting to this very theoretical conception of or not consented to this very theoretical conception of just war does not extend, right? So second point about public opinion, and that's where First of all, we think that it is not the most impactful clash into this debate because wars will happen regardless, right? But we think that on the marginal benefit that you actually have the public discourse to stop those wars, we think that uniquely our government analyzed to you why it is far better that you have a discourse that is based on public opinion rather than a judicial process. Why is that? My previous member has mentioned to you the very motion basically prioritize U.S. military soldiers over actual victims of war, right? So the only way you actually understand this war is unjust on some level is actually to understand victim story and all that. And thirdly, we think that judicial discourse is unlikely to yield a just result because their case hinges on the idea that this military members will actually win those suits. Whereas we have challenged you repeatedly, which is not engaged on their side, that the court is perfectly able to establish a precedent that this war is okay for the government to continue conduct wars in the future. And finally, we think the most important clash is on how this will change soldiers' behavior, right? And our member talked to you about how this will actually place the moral burden on the government rather than individual soldiers. So our member has told you, for example, evil soldiers will just continue to commit those humanitarian abuses because they think that somehow they can just sue the government, saying that the government is responsible for that. And even for ordinary soldiers who are not fear-mongering, we think that it is more likely that they will not think twice before they fire upon civilians. And for all those reasons, we are extremely proud to